In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to add constructor methods to our classes. So let's get started. We've got three learning goals today. The first is that we can explain the purpose and use of a class constructor method. The second is that we can properly create a default and a parameterized constructor. And finally, that we can explain and use a new special reference called this. We've seen constructor methods a little bit before, so let's just chat and review about exactly what they're used for. So first of all, a constructor method is a method that's automatically called when an object is created. And so on the right, you can see some examples. When I say new scanner or new tweet or new string, the constructor method is automatically invoked. And the purpose of it is to give the object its initial values. It can be used for other things too, but that's probably the main reason we make constructors. Now, if the programmer doesn't specify a constructor, a generic one is automatically provided. And so that would be the case in our tweet. When we wrote the tweet class in the last lesson, we did not create any constructor methods, yet there is a constructor there that doesn't really do much of anything, and so of course we'll end up writing our own. And generally speaking, it's best practice to have a constructor, at least one, in all your classes. In the code you're seeing on the screen, I've added a constructor method to the tweet class that we did in the last lesson. So let's just remember what makes it a constructor. First of all, in order to be a constructor, the method must share its name with the class. So my class is tweet with a capital T. My constructor method is called tweet with a capital T. The other thing that makes it a constructor is that there is no return type, not even void. And you can see that I say public tweet, not public int tweet, not public string tweet, not public void tweet, just public tweet. And if those two things are in place, we have the same name as the class, and we have no return type, we've created what Java will recognize as a constructor. And then what happens is when we create the object, tweet t equals new tweet, the constructor method is called. And in fact, the actual call to the constructor method happens right here, and that's why you see this empty set of parentheses, because I am indeed calling a method. And the purpose of the constructor, as we said before, is to often initialize the instance variables. So you can see we set the text instance variable and author instance variable to an empty string, and we initialize the likes variable to 0. Now, what I've created has a very specific name. This is actually called a default constructor. And a default constructor is a constructor that has no parameters and simply sets all of the variables to their initial values. It is best practice for all classes to have a default constructor, though as we'll see on the next slide, we are probably going to want to add some additional constructors as well. In the tweet class on the right, you can see that I've added a second constructor to the class. And notice again, it shares its name with the class, public tweet, and there's no return type, not even void. But the difference is, in this constructor, I have included parameters. And it's really common for classes to have multiple constructors, and the reason that they have this is that it provides multiple ways to instantiate an object. So what I mean by that is here's two cases. So I've got two tweet objects, T and T2, and if we look at the first tweet object, T, I say new tweet and include nothing in the parentheses. Therefore, that will invoke the default constructor and set the text, author, and likes as you see in that method. However, when I make a second tweet, this one includes two parameters, and Java will automatically know to call the parameterized constructor, the one with parameters, and initialize the data accordingly. In this case, setting the text and author to their respective parameters, and then still setting the likes to its default value of 0. And so this is an example of something we talked about earlier in the year, which is the idea of method overloading. Two methods with the same name, but they have different parameters, and the purpose is to give the user, the client of this class, options on how they create objects. Since we're talking about constructors, this would be a good time to talk about one of Java's special references. Now, I could have taught you this back in a previous unit when we actually did a lesson on references, but at the time, there wouldn't have been a way to apply that information, and I think you would have found it confusing. But now that we're talking about constructors, I think we can get a handle on this. So to start out, I'd like you to consider the point class, which is shown on the right, and its constructor. And I'd like you to pause the video and study it a little bit and see if there's anything that maybe just doesn't hit you quite right, something that's confusing. And when you're ready, resume the video and we'll talk about what we saw. All right, hopefully you've had a chance to look at the point class, and maybe you noticed that there is some confusion between the variables x and y. Specifically, I've got two x's and two y's. I've got an instance data at the top, x and y, because point objects have an x coordinate and a y coordinate, but then I also have these parameters x and y. And then it gets even more confusing because when I say x equals x and y equals y, which x am I talking about and which y am I talking about? Of course, the intent is to take the parameter x and assign it to the instance data, and to take the parameter y and assign it to the instance data. But Java has no way to know that. And in actuality, when we say x and y, as far as Java is concerned, we are only talking about these. Java has no idea that we might be referring to the instance variables at this point. And so we need to figure out how to deal with this. Now, one solution is to just change the names of the variables. There's nothing that says I have to have a variable x and I have to have a variable y. I could call them something different and then avoid the confusion altogether. But suppose I didn't want to do that. And if I didn't want to do that, I could use the this reference. And in Java, the word this is how an object refers to itself. And so notice the change that I just made. Rather than saying x equals x, I'm saying this dot x equals x and this dot y equals y. See, using the word this, I can tell Java to refer to the object, not the parameter. In other words, it basically works like this here. When I say x, I am referring to the parameter. When I say this dot x, I'm saying this object's x. I'm talking about the instance variable. And so what is actually happening now, you can see it with the arrows, is I'm saying change the instance x to the parameter x, change the instance y to the parameter y. Again, not something you have to do, but you do need to know about the this reference, and this is a really good example of where you might actually use it. It is actually incredibly common for programmers to write their constructors in this way, where they do use the exact same variable names and then use the this reference to distinguish between the parameters and the instance data. Now that we know a little bit about constructors and the this reference, it's time to check your understanding. We've already written a constructor that's a default, right? It has no parameters and it gives default values to the text, the author, and the likes. We also wrote a parameterized constructor that had two parameters for the text and the author while still setting likes to a default value. And what I'd like you to do is think about how you would add a third constructor that only has one parameter. This parameter will set the text, and then the constructor will give default values to the author and the likes. In addition, I would like you to demonstrate that you understand the this reference by making it part of your answer. Pause the video, and when you're ready, we'll see what the answer is. So here we have our solution. Just a couple of things to remember. Number one, notice that I did name my constructor the same name as the class tweet. Also notice there is no return type, not even void. This one has one parameter, so the other constructors had no parameters and two parameters. You will see that I set the text to the parameter. I gave author a default value, and I set the likes equal to 0. Now, one thing I wanted to mention here when we talk about the this reference, Sometimes you need it and sometimes you don't. So in the solution here, I definitely need to say this dot text equals text because my parameter is named text and my instance data is named text, and there has to be a way to distinguish which one I want. In the next line, I said this dot author equals anonymous. It is perfectly legal to say this dot author. However, in this case, it isn't required that I do so because there is no ambiguity. I don't have another variable named author, and so there is no confusion for Java. It simply knows that it needs to talk about to the instance data. And you can see for the likes, I did not use this. I did not say this dot likes equals 0, though I could have and it would have been legal. But again, there's no ambiguity, so it's not necessary. The only time I need to use the this reference, generally speaking, is to get rid of ambiguity when I have two variables, or it could be two methods that have the same name. Now that you've watched this lesson, you should be able to make and use class constructors. You should be able to properly create both default and parameterized constructors, and also be able to explain and use the this reference. Thanks for watching.